It was just another ordinary morning at one of the city's most prestigious companies. The towering glass doors reflected the rising sun as employees in crisp suits hurried inside, their minds occupied with meetings and deadlines. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my channel. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And do not forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. The marble-floored lobby buzzed with the sound of ringing phones, the clicking of high heels, and muffled conversations. Everything seemed perfectly in place until he walked in. A man, dressed in worn-out clothes and carrying a tattered bag, stepped through the grand entrance. His hair was slightly unkempt, his shoes scuffed, and his face bore a quiet, almost unreadable expression. The moment he entered, the atmosphere shifted. Employees exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes silently questioning his presence. Some whispered behind their hands, while others simply stared. At the reception desk, a sharply dressed woman arched an eyebrow as she watched him approach. She leaned slightly toward her colleague and whispered, "Who let him in here? This place is for professionals, not people like that." The man, unfazed by the stares, walked further into the lobby, his eyes scanning the surroundings as if he was seeing them for the first time. A few employees hurried past him, avoiding eye contact, while others simply stood back, watching with curiosity and skepticism. "Sir, may I help you?" the receptionist finally asked, her voice polite but laced with suspicion. The man looked at her and smiled gently. "I'm here to see the manager," he said, in a calm, steady tone. The receptionist hesitated for a moment, glancing at his appearance once more before reluctantly picking up the phone. As she informed the manager, her eyes never left him, filled with doubt and curiosity. Meanwhile, in the background, small groups of employees had started to form, murmuring amongst themselves. Some chuckled, while others speculated why someone like him would even step into such a prestigious company. "Probably looking for a job," one of them muttered with a smirk. "Or worse, asking for money," another chimed in. What they didn't know was that this poor man was no stranger to this place. In fact, he knew every corner of the building better than anyone, because this man was their CEO. He had built this company from the ground up, pouring his heart and soul into its success. But lately, he had begun to notice something troubling. Stories of employees mistreating visitors, valuing appearances over character, and focusing solely on profit had reached his ears. He wanted to see it with his own eyes, to witness how they treated someone they deemed unimportant. As he stood there, observing the hurried, judgmental faces around him, a quiet determination settled in his eyes. The test had begun, and what he would uncover in the next few moments would change everything. The receptionist tapped her perfectly manicured nails against the desk, her impatience growing with each passing second. She stole another glance at the man standing before her, his worn-out jacket, the frayed edges of his shirt, the way he clutched his bag tightly as if it contained everything he owned. She forced a tight smile, but there was no warmth behind it. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice coated in forced politeness. "Our manager is quite busy today. Are you sure you have an appointment?" The man nodded slowly. "I believe he'll want to see me," he replied, his tone calm but firm. She sighed, clearly unconvinced, and turned to her colleague, lowering her voice but not enough to escape his ears. "Why do these people always think they can just walk in?" she muttered. "It's a corporate office, not a charity." Behind him, several employees stood watching the scene unfold. Some whispered behind their hands, smirking at the man's persistence. Others scrolled through their phones, pretending not to notice, but stealing occasional glances filled with curiosity and amusement. A young intern, standing nearby, whispered to his coworker, "I bet security's gonna throw him out any second now." The man remained quiet, observing every reaction, every expression. He could see it all, the arrogance, the judgment, the lack of empathy. He noticed the way people averted their eyes when he looked at them, as if avoiding any association with him. Just then, a senior manager, Mr. Peterson, stepped into the lobby. Tall, confident, and dressed in an expensive tailored suit, he exuded authority. His sharp eyes landed on the stranger, and he frowned instantly. "What's going on here?" Peterson asked, his voice echoing across the lobby. Before the receptionist could respond, she gestured towards the man dismissively. "This gentleman insists on meeting with you, sir. I told him you're busy, but—" Peterson's lips curled into a slight sneer as he looked the man up and down. "I'm afraid you're in the wrong place," he said bluntly. "We don't have any job openings that might suit you. Perhaps you should try somewhere more appropriate." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. The man looked at Peterson, studying him intently, but said nothing. Peterson folded his arms and sighed, clearly wanting to get rid of him. "Look, I appreciate your determination, but this is a professional environment. We can't have just anyone walking in off the street." A long silence followed. The man tilted his head slightly and spoke, his voice soft yet piercing. "I see. So this is how your company treats people who don't fit the mold?" Peterson smirked. "Sir, in business, first impressions matter, and frankly, yours isn't great." The man gave a small, knowing smile and reached into his pocket. For a moment, Peterson's expression shifted, half expecting him to pull out a crumpled resume or some desperate plea for help. But what the man produced instead was something no one expected: an ID card. As he placed it calmly on the reception desk, the receptionist's eyes widened in shock. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, staring at the name embossed in gold lettering. The laughter and whispers died instantly. The realization hit them like a thunderbolt. This wasn't just some random stranger. This was Richard Lawson, the company's founder and CEO. Peterson's face drained of color, his confident posture crumbling in an instant. The crowd stood frozen, eyes darting from the CEO to each other, their expressions filled with disbelief and regret. The man, their CEO, looked around the room, his eyes lingering on each of them for a brief moment, letting the weight of their actions sink in. "Interesting," he finally said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "Very interesting indeed." The lobby, once bustling with activity and chatter, had now fallen into an eerie silence. All eyes were locked on the worn-out ID card resting on the desk, bold letters spelling out Richard Lawson, CEO. The same man they had whispered about, judged, and dismissed without a second thought, was the very person who built the company from the ground up. Peterson swallowed hard, his confident demeanor replaced by an awkward stiffness. The receptionist, whose voice had once dripped with condescension, now looked pale and flustered. She fumbled with the card, as if holding it made the situation even more real. Mr. Lawson, I didn't realize," she stammered, forcing an uneasy smile. Richard simply raised a hand, silencing her without a word. His eyes, sharp yet calm, moved slowly across the room, meeting the faces of his employees one by one. Some lowered their gazes in shame. Others stood frozen, their expressions a mixture of embarrassment and fear. "You didn't realize," he repeated softly, nodding. "I see." He stepped forward, his presence suddenly feeling larger than before. Employees who had once sneered now stepped aside, clearing his path as if he carried an invisible force. "For the past several months," he began, his voice steady, "I've been hearing troubling things about how visitors, clients, and even potential employees are treated here. Stories of arrogance, judgment, and a complete lack of empathy." He paused, letting his words sink in. The employees shifted uncomfortably, stealing nervous glances at one another. "So I decided," Richard continued, "to see it for myself." The weight of his statement hung in the air. A few employees glanced toward Peterson, silently blaming him, but deep down, they all knew they were equally guilty. "I walked in here today," Richard said, gesturing to his appearance, "dressed as an outsider, someone who didn't fit your expectations. And instead of a warm welcome or even basic respect, I was met with judgment, whispers, and arrogance." His gaze fell on Peterson, who stood stiffly, his jaw clenched. "And you," Richard said, his tone unchanging but firm, "were ready to send me away without even asking who I was or why I was here." Peterson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, realizing there was no way back. Richard took a deep breath, his expression softening, but his disappointment still evident. "This company wasn't built on appearances," he said. "It was built on values, hard work, respect, and integrity. Yet today, I've seen those very values thrown aside." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some employees nodded subtly, realizing their mistake. Others remained silent, too ashamed to speak. Richard took another step forward. "Do you know the irony of all this?" he asked, letting a small, sad smile form on his face. "I was once just like the man you thought I was today. Struggling, looking for a chance. Someone gave it to me. And now I stand here, giving you all yours." He let his words linger, watching their reactions carefully. "But the question is, do you deserve it?" The employees looked at each other, guilt written across their faces. The receptionist lowered her head. Peterson swallowed hard, and the interns who once whispered now stood motionless, their faces red with shame. Richard nodded slowly, letting the moment sink in. "We'll see," he said, his voice quieter but no less commanding. Turning on his heel, he started walking toward the elevators, leaving an entire office full of stunned, regretful employees in his wake. As the elevator doors closed behind Richard, the entire lobby remained frozen in stunned silence. The weight of his words pressed heavily on every employee's shoulders. Conversations that once buzzed with casual gossip were now replaced with nervous whispers and uneasy glances. Peterson ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply as he turned to the receptionist. "Why didn't you—" he began, but the receptionist cut him off with a glare. "Don't blame me, Peterson. You were the one who practically threw him out." Meanwhile, a young intern, still clutching his notebook tightly, swallowed hard. "I can't believe that was really him," he murmured to his colleague. We treated him like he was nothing." A senior executive, Ms. Harper, who had remained silent until now, cleared her throat. "This isn't about blame," she said firmly. "This is about us. All of us." Upstairs, in the CEO's office, Richard stood at the window, gazing down at the bustling city below. His reflection stared back at him, an older, wiser version of the young man who once walked into an office just like this one, desperate for an opportunity. He could still remember the way people had looked at him back then, the way they had doubted him. Sighing, He turned to his assistant, who stood nervously by the door. "Call an all-staff meeting," Richard said calmly. "Immediately." Back in the lobby, phones rang and emails buzzed as the announcement spread like wildfire. Mandatory company-wide meeting in the main hall. Now employees exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what was coming next. Some straightened their ties, others adjusted their hair, trying to look more professional than they had just moments ago. 15 minutes later, the entire company had gathered in the spacious conference hall. The air was thick with anxiety as Richard walked in, his presence alone commanding everyone's attention. He scanned the crowd, his eyes filled with both disappointment and something else. Hope. "Let's talk," Richard began, his voice steady but kind. "Today, you all revealed more about yourselves than any performance review ever could." A murmur passed through the crowd, but no one dared to speak. "I walked in here today as a test," he continued, pacing slowly across the stage. "A test not of your skills or your qualifications, but of your character. And I have to say, many of you failed." He paused, letting the statement sink in. A few employees fidgeted uncomfortably in their seats, while others stared at the floor, avoiding his gaze. "But," Richard added, his voice softening, "failure isn't final. It's a chance to learn, and today, we're going to do just that." He turned toward the massive screen behind him, where a simple phrase appeared in bold letters. "Respect is the foundation of success." "The real question," Richard said, looking back at them, "is how do we move forward from here?" The room fell silent, every individual deep in thought, as they realized that today wasn't just a test. It was an opportunity to change. A heavy silence filled the conference hall. Employees shifted in their seats, their faces reflecting guilt, shame, and realization. Richard stood on the stage, his gaze scanning the crowd, waiting for someone, anyone, to step up and take accountability. After what felt like an eternity, Peterson finally stood up. His usually confident voice wavered as he spoke. "Sir, I won't make excuses. I judged you based on appearances, and I was wrong." He swallowed hard, his pride giving way to sincerity. "I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and I failed to live up to the values this company stands for." Richard nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Acknowledgement is the first step," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But change requires action." From the back of the room, the receptionist stood up as well, her hands trembling. "Mr. Lawson, I realize now that I was quick to dismiss you. I've learned something valuable today. Everyone deserves respect, no matter how they look." A murmur rippled through the crowd as more employees began nodding in agreement. Some looked at each other with newfound understanding, while others stared at their hands, reflecting on their actions. Richard took a deep breath and continued. "Respect isn't just a word we throw around in mission statements. It's something we practice every single day. It's in the way we treat our clients, our colleagues, and even strangers who walk through that door." He walked down from the stage, stepping closer to the employees, making the moment feel more personal. "I built this company with one belief. Opportunity should be given to those who are willing to work for it, not to those who just look the part." The employees exchanged guilty glances, their earlier behavior now weighing heavily on them. Some whispered apologies to their colleagues, while others sat in silence, absorbing the lesson. Richard continued, "This company thrives because of people, not appearances. We're better than what I saw today. And moving forward, things will change." He paused, then looked at Peterson and the receptionist. Starting with both of you, he said. You'll be working with HR to implement a new training program, one that teaches every employee the importance of humility, empathy, and respect. Peterson nodded, his earlier arrogance replaced with a newfound sense of responsibility. Understood, sir. Richard smiled faintly. Good, because today wasn't just about me walking in dressed as someone else. It was about all of you seeing who you really are and who you have the potential to become. The employees erupted in a round of applause, soft at first, then growing louder, not out of obligation, but out of genuine appreciation for the lesson they had learned. Richard looked around the room, his heart filled with hope. He had come in looking for answers, and now he had found something even better: change. As the applause slowly faded, Richard looked around the room, seeing something different in his employees' eyes: reflection, growth, and perhaps redemption. The atmosphere that once brimmed with arrogance and judgment now felt lighter, filled with the silent promise of change. Richard took a deep breath, his voice steady, yet warm. Today wasn't just a test for you, it was a test for us. And while mistakes were made, I believe mistakes can be our greatest teachers, if we're willing to learn from them. He glanced at Peterson, the receptionist, and the interns who had once whispered behind his back. Each of them now stood with their heads held higher, not in pride, but in resolve. Moving forward, Richard continued, this company will stand for more than just profits and prestige. We will stand for respect, humility, and integrity. And it starts with each of you, right here, right now. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Employees nodded, exchanging small, hopeful smiles. It was as if they had been given a second chance, a rare opportunity to rebuild their workplace culture from the inside out. Richard took one final look at his team. Because at the end of the day, he said, true success isn't measured by what's in our bank accounts or the clothes we wear, but by the way we treat people, no matter where they come from. He stepped back, allowing his words to settle. The employees broke into applause once more, this time louder, more genuine. It wasn't just for Richard, but for the lesson they had all learned today. As the meeting concluded and employees left the hall, conversations were different now. No more whispers or judgmental glances, just quiet determination and a newfound sense of purpose. Peterson approached Richard, extending his hand. Thank you, sir, he said sincerely, for giving us another chance. Richard shook his hand firmly. Just make sure you use it. With that, he walked away, leaving behind an office that would never be the same again. And as he stepped outside, feeling the fresh breeze on his face, he smiled. Because sometimes, the smallest lessons create the biggest changes. Moral of the story: respect should never depend on appearances, and kindness costs nothing, but means everything.